Today we have a really great interview with scholar Matthew Halsted about the Rapture, and we'll be talking about the points he makes in his book, The End of the World as You Know It, which we will link to in the show notes. But before we get into that, I just wanted to call out that you might hear some technical difficulties on my end. I had to improvise where I was at and use my phone. If you're watching the video, you'll notice at the end of the video, my phone starts to get a little weird with the video and audio. So again, apologies for those missteps, but it's a really great interview that I think is going to be helpful. So here we go. Welcome back to the Bible in Context.
Good to be here. So this is where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Absolutely. And today we have a special guest with us. Once again, we have Matt Halsted, who is the author of a number of works. But today we want to talk about The End of the World as You Know It. You know that song from Independence Day? I can't help but think of that movie every time I hear the title. I love it. But no, we're going to be talking a little bit about what is the end of the world going to look like, in particular the rapture. He is also, just real quickly, I just want to introduce you a little bit better, Matt. You are associate professor of biblical studies at Eternity Bible College, and also you're the host of the Bible Unmuted, which I keep up with that podcast. It's very good, especially if you want to go through Romans or Revelation. There's lots of one-off stuff too, but great resources for those. Just want to throw that out there. But yeah, great to have you on the show, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show, guys. It's a privilege to be here and to chat with you about a fascinating topic.
Absolutely. Well, give us a little bit of background to what led up to this book. Just kind of introduce the book for us, and then we'll dive into some questions about the rapture and just tackle that sticky topic.
Yeah, so when it comes to the book and the genesis of the book, how it got off the ground is back in 2020, around the COVID era, when that was kicking off, I was just paying attention to what was being said on social media about the COVID stuff, but it was being paired with a lot of like passages from scripture, especially like Revelation. There were rumors floating around that certain things in contemporary culture were the mark of the beast, and I just saw the mark of the beast passage being applied in ways that I didn't think were correct. And so my wife and I would talk about what we were seeing, and she said, you should really consider sharing publicly, about those passages in Revelation. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I want to dive into that. And she persuaded me to do it, actually. And so I did. And so I cut out my iPhone and opened up the Notes app. And I just scribbled up some thoughts on the mark of the beast. And then I just shared it on Facebook. And it resonated with a lot of people. It was, widely shared, and people really enjoyed reading it. And then a friend of mine who at the time was an editor, his name's Tavis. Tavis was an editor over at the Logos Academic blog. So Logos Bible Software had a blog at the time called Logos Academic blog. It's now called Word by Word, if I believe. Anyway, he said, hey, can we use that? Can we post that to the blog? And I was like, yeah, sure. Let me just tweak it, for that audience. And so we did. And at that time, I don't know if it's still true today, but at that time when it was published on their blog, it was the most read blog they'd ever, published on their website. So one thing led to another, and I wrote a follow-up article for it and expanded on a few of my thoughts. And then Tavis just mentioned casually, hey, how quick could you put this into a book? Because he's an editor. And I was like, oh, I could do something pretty quick. And so anyway, long story short, that was the genesis of the book. And it was eventually published this year of 2024, February.
Awesome. Yeah.
Very cool.
My wife and I have been going through the book, actually, and it's really just great to see so many concepts have been in my own context, very much tied into the events of eschatology, looking for the end times, but really, I think it refocuses on, first of all, a proper hermeneutic for, end times texts, but also just points us back to our hope is not in these events. Our hope is in Jesus. So I've appreciated it.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I'm glad it's helpful.
Yeah.
So if you're from the West, you've probably heard of the Rapture. Most people have, especially if you grew up in the the 90s and Left Behind series. But just so that we're on the same page, how would you define the rapture?
Yeah, it all depends on what we mean by that. In popular Christian theology, if you go to your bookstore and you go to the prophecy section, you'll find many books on the rapture. And what typically people mean by the rapture is this idea that at some point, any point, actually, it's an imminent sort of event, meaning it'll happen when you least expect it. Jesus will return, not all the way down to the earth, but like halfway into the clouds, and he will rapture up his saints and then take them away to heaven for like 7 years or so. And then during that 7 years, after the church has been raptured away, you have a 7-year period or thereabouts of just chaos, of tribulation, of the rise of the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, persecution, and all those sorts of things. It's a very terrible time. And then at the end of that 7 years, Jesus comes back with his saints, okay, and then sets up a 1,000-year reign, millennial kingdom, and he bounds Satan for that 1,000 years. And after the 1,000 years, he's released again, and then there's the final battle. And so what you have in that scenario is this idea that Jesus essentially comes back 3 times, or comes back 2 other times, right? You have this first advent, then you have this quasi return at the rapture, then you have his complete return the 3rd time. And so that's the popular conception of rapture theology. In my book, I take a different approach. I don't think that's how it works. I don't think Scripture is going to give us, I don't think it portrays Jesus coming back 2 additional times. I think it portrays him coming back 1 more time.
Yeah, I like that you actually put this in your book. It's on page 91, talking about your own experience just as a kid, saying, we were warned. The rapture is going to happen, and you don't want to be left behind. As a teenager, I took that especially to heart, that message to heart. So you actually originally were brought up believing in the rapture, it sounds like, and then the biblical evidence led you away from that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was just sort of the world in which I was in, being raised in the Bible Belt in very evangelical contexts. That was the way of thinking about the end times, and it was tied very closely to politics and tied in very closely to world events. And so because of that, it was like the perfect storm, because at that period you had a new thing called 24-hour news cycle. And what that did was it brought world events to your living room every second of your existence, right? Whether it was talk radio or it was cable news or satellite news or whatever. And moreover, then you had competition. You had other outlets doing 24-hour news cycles, and they would compete with each other. And in order to compete in this market, you had to win audiences, and the way you win audiences is through like scaring them, right? And so you had that. So what my point is because Christians tied in and had for a long time Jesus's second coming or his rapture to world events, and then given that world events were in your neighborhood or in your living room every second of your existence, that means that the rapture was constantly on everybody's mind, right? And you had to be ready, you had to be prepared, and it just a whole generation was inoculated on this whole idea of the imminent return of Christ, and I can't explain it, but it was I think for some people it was pretty scary, because you get one shot, and it was like you didn't know when it was going to happen, and it also created this idea. Sorry, I'm just blabbering here, but you've asked the question, so you get on this idea that life and history and the world as we know it will come to a radical end for you. And then you have an existential choice. What do you do with your life? Because you don't know when history's coming to an end, right? And so you're not sure about jobs to pick. You're not sure about families. You're not sure about marriages. Are those even relevant? Are those even relevant anymore in a world where you will have collapsing at any moment and you'll be taken away? And so as I began reading scripture and thinking through this, I began to see, wait a second, God's way of writing history is not that it comes to a radical end like that the rapture theology gives us, but rather what it is, it comes to a transformation such that my careers, my life, my marriage, my whatever, it's not that it's going to come to an end in the way that we were told, but it's actually going to be transformed into something beautiful. So history is not coming to an end, but it's coming to a culmination, not an end point, but a telos culmination idea, and that's how I saw it. And so it was just the picture wasn't like completely wrong. I still believe Jesus is coming back and things are going to change when he comes back. But the problem is that way of telling that story was just shifted in a way that wasn't healthy. And so that was sort of that world, not just me, but a lot of people grew up in.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that it fosters not so much of a hopeful expectation of the return of Jesus, but more of a are you rapture ready? Scare you into it kind of mentality for some. And for some, the reason I wanted you to walk through that was just because this is built into the core of some people's just their theology and their hope. And so I just wanted to show, like, it's the biblical evidence that has taken you from one stance to another. You're not, on some vendetta against the rapture since the beginning of your Christian life. You instead have come from that and then looked at the evidence in the Bible, the biblical text, the way it is structured, and seen maybe something else is going on. And the way to be honest to who Jesus calls us to be and what his word is telling us perhaps will lead us in a different way. And so if, as a listener, if that's you who you believe in the rapture and you're not so sure about this, but you're still listening, keep listening, because I think that this is going to be a faithful interpretation. We're not just out to get rid of this theology that we just don't like. Now, one thing, whenever I think of the rapture growing up, the first passage I always thought of was, two in the field, one is left, one is taken. Two grinding at the mill, one is left, one is taken, in Matthew 24.
I can still remember in college listening over and over to that song that DC Talk made popular. I wish they'd all been ready. It comes from straight from this passage. I think it's one of the reasons this passage became so popular.
And they actually they did that song as a redo. It was actually Larry Norman,
right,
prior to them, who made the song actually well known. Yeah.
Forgot about Larry Norman. Haven't heard him in a while.
Yeah.
Well, let me just read a couple of verses from Matthew 24. I want to read 37 through 41, and if you could just give us some comment on that about do we want to be left or do we want to be taken? Is this the rapture? So Matthew 24, 37 through 41 says, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left." Okay, so clearly people are being taken up into the sky to avoid the judgment. Correct?
So this is what I was talking about. Is like, the scene, the situation isn't wrong. It's just tilted in a way that's unproductive, right? And I feel like that the popular interpretation of that passage is a bit like trying to drive with 3D glasses on. You can see, but the red and the blue, as it negotiates with each other, is going to mess up the scene a little bit, and you might make some mistakes, right? You get the picture, but it's not the exact thing. Yeah, so let's just make a few comments on this. So the word in 37 that Jesus uses is parsia, and parsia is translated as the coming of Christ. And really, I mean, that's a fine translation, but what's really a better way of putting it is the presencing of Jesus, like him showing up, his being there, like him. Kind of think of like how the disciples are like, "Hey, are you gonna when is your ministry gonna go public? When are you gonna take this kingdom thing seriously? When are you gonna present yourself to people?" And that presenting yourself to people, to the world, is parousia. It's not just coming, although that's implied, but it's more like a showing up, a presencing of. That's how I translate it in the book. Actually, is presencing, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it's a presencing. So the popular idea is to take this passage, and I've got it pulled up here, and it says, verse 40, the two will be in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. And this is the whole left behind idea, so, right? This is where the book gets its title. Left behind comes from verse 40 here, right? And so the idea is that you don't want to be left behind. You want to be the ones who are like caught up and taken away. That's the rapture. Okay. Well, I actually would push against that idea. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here. I think the taking away is not a taking away to heaven, but it's actually a taking away to judgment. Okay. Now, how do I know that? Well, because of the analogy that Jesus uses in the two verses prior to that. It says he compares this event, this showing up. He compares this to the days of Noah. He said everybody's like eating and drinking. They're just living a life. They're marrying. They're giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So this sweeping away, who's getting swept away? Noah? No. He's okay. The people getting swept away are those who are not in the ark, who are not in the ark of salvation, right? And then he says, so too will be the coming of the Son of Man. I mean, it's going to be like this. That's how it's going to be. Two will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left, right? And this idea is that one's going to be taken in this flood. Now, the flood is a highly evocative sort of story. It's a story of judgment. It's a story of the chaos caving in back on the world, and the world is like imploding. So in Genesis 1, God puts boundaries on the waters so that the waters are tamed and disciplined, if you will. And here in the flood story, God removes his protective grace, and the flood comes back upon the earth, and it's like the earth is imploding on itself. It's uncreation, right? And that's what Jesus is saying here, is that in this story, when Jesus comes, it'll be a lot like that, and you'll be swept away. So actually, this passage, in other words, is not telling you to be afraid of being left behind. It's saying you better hope you are.
Right, exactly. And something I noticed as I was reading through this, it's unfortunate that, and it makes sense, the word swept away there, I believe, I can't recall the Greek term off my head, I don't have my Greek up right now, but being swept away and being taken away, those are different Greek words, but they're roughly synonymous. And so you're already listening. Whenever he says swept away and then taken away, you're automatically seeing them swept away in the flood.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the kind of the idea here is, word studies can be deceiving in a way, right? People think if I just know the Greek, then I have all the answers. And actually, the opposite's true. If you just know the Greek, you might have more questions. And if you're putting all your basis on just like a word study, it could lead you astray. So can you imagine 1,000 years from now, people who are studying English, 21st century American English, are going to say, oh, they had this interesting word butterfly. Well, let's analyze the word butterfly. Well, the word butter meant this. You put it on your toast, and then fly, maybe they threw the butter or threw it at each other. So, those sort of etymological analyses of words can be deceiving because butterfly has nothing to do with your toast. Okay.
Right.
And so when we go back to the Bible, we need to make sure we don't make those sort of same mistakes. Just because you have two different words doesn't mean you have two different concepts. So that's something I think we should keep in mind.
Right. That just kind of caught my attention, that the two statements of being swept away and then taken, they're in the structure of the paragraph meant to be paralleled, it seemed to me. And so, like you said,
they are. I think they are.
I think that's so helpful because I wanted to touch on that passage first, just because there are other more forceful rapture passages in the Bible, but or supposedly, but this is always the one that when I thought rapture, this came to my mind. I'm sure the same is true for you, Nate, and probably you too, Matt.
Yeah, for sure. I want to take a look at another passage that's often used to talk about the rapture. You mentioned on page 97 of your book, Revelation 3. I'm going to read verses 10 and 11. Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world, to try those who dwell on the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. And so how do you explain this passage?
Yeah, so before we answer that question, we kind of need to look at what popular prophecy teachers do with it. Popular prophecy teachers are going to do something kind of funky with this passage. So in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, you have these specific letters to the churches. You have 7 churches, 7 letters. What popular prophecy teachers end up doing is, many of them interpret these individual letters to the 7 churches as individual notes to 7 eras of church history. So, for example, Ephesus, the letter to Ephesus is going to be like the first period of church history, and they might draw the line. They actually draw the line in various different ways. And so, and you go all the way down these letters, and you get to Laodicea, and people are like, oh, yeah, we live in the days of Laodicea. Somebody asked me that one time. Like, do you believe we live in the days of Laodicea? And I knew what they meant. Like, are we in that time frame? Have we passed the other ones, and have we come to Laodicea? The problem with the 7 eras of church history view here is that it's completely wrong. I don't want to put it so bluntly, but let me give reasons why I think it's wrong. As numerous scholars point out, the reason it's problematic is because it has a flat view of church history. So, for example, let's use Laodicea. Laodicea, that church, is criticized in John's letter to them because they are neither cold nor hot. In other words, they're not useful. They're not useful to the kingdom. They're just sort of playing around with their Christianity, and they're lukewarm. Right. They have the appearance of, but not the power of the Christian life, essentially. And so people say, oh, see, that's church today. We're just a lukewarm church. We're not really that serious. We're Christians in name only. And therefore, we're in that stage of church history that's lukewarm. Now, what I like to point out is, well, wait a second. How can you say that as a general rule for all Christians in the world? If you're thinking about the American church, I might agree with you. But if you're thinking about the church in Iran or North Korea or China or in these other places, like, they're on fire for Jesus. Like, these people are not lukewarm. And so the next question is, why do you have an America-centric view of Christianity? And in fact, that might reveal your way of interpreting Scripture, and namely that it's problematic, because what justification do you have for interpreting global Christianity in this verse in light of your Americanism? Okay, and why don't you interpret it in light of the church in Iran, which is growing like weeds there? And so it's a very flattened view of church history. It's a flattened view of global history. It's a flattened view of the global church today. It doesn't do justice to the church in the majority world. In fact, it forgets them altogether. And lastly, it forgets the first century meaning, right? Like, if it's true that Laodicea is about this era of church history, like right now, then that means it had no application to them in the first century.
Right.
And it's just irrelevant to them because it has nothing to do. So that these are all these problems. Now, why is this important to your question? Because this verse you read is a note to the Philadelphians. I will keep you from, the hour of trial or whatever. And what some prophecy teachers will say is, see, that's talking about the generation of the church that will be raptured. He will keep the people. If you're raptured, you're kept from the 7-year tribulation. But again, I just want to point out that has that makes a number of assumptions that I've just sort of dismissed for good reason. For that to work, you're going to have the 7 era of church history view, which is just loaded with all sorts of problems. And moreover, if that's talking about the rapture, then it is completely irrelevant to the Philadelphian church in the first century, which does not seem to be. John certainly doesn't want them to think his message to them is irrelevant. He wants them to actually obey what he's saying to them. Yeah, I'll read start 96, 97. It says, another big question with regard to the church age theory is how it understands Jesus' promise to keep the Philadelphian church from the hour of trial. Revelation 3:10, that's what Nathan was reading. But why is this taken to refer to the final tribulation? Can't it simply be a promise to the local Philadelphian church that they will be preserved through and not be taken out of an upcoming season of difficulty? LaHaye and John MacArthur, that's Tim LaHaye, Left Behind series author, and then John MacArthur, he's a pastor and commentator. They object to this idea by pointing to the Greek word ek, which means from or out. That word occurs in this verse. This means that, they argue, this means that Jesus promises to take Christians from the trial by rapturing them out of this world. But does this objection work? That's my question to the reader. I say, read again what Jesus tells the Philadelphians. Quote, I will keep you ek, the hour of trial. Notice that Jesus is not saying he will keep Christians from the world, but from a situation that is going to happen in the world. This is very similar to Jesus' prayer in John 17, verse 15, where he prays for his followers to be preserved in the world. He says, quote, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, or ek, the world, but that you keep them from, ek, the evil one. This seems to be what Jesus has in mind for the Philadelphians too. If so, it would make sense of the next verse where Jesus encourages them to stay faithful until the end. You don't need to tell them to stay faithful until the end if they're going to be taken out of the world.
Yeah, it'd be pretty easy at that
You
point.
see what I mean? Yeah, that's right. So there's just some problems here. I'm not suggesting that the whole thing needs to be canned. We need to shift the scene a little bit to make better sense, because Jesus is promising a preservation of sorts. Okay, so I can agree with LaHaye and MacArthur on that, but how does he preserve? It's not from taking us out, but preserving us within.
Right. And I want to touch on, too, the fact that he promises about the hour of trial coming on the whole world, the oikomenes, the whole world. And so, that's often taken to mean that trial is coming on the entire earth. This is like some giant end times cataclysmic event. But that word oikomenos, the whole world is just, and other similar phrases are used in kind of a relative sense. And I want to pick up, you gave a few examples, but I really like the example in Romans 10:18 where Paul uses Psalms 19 to talk about the spread of the gospel. And he says, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out over all the earth, all their words to the ends of the world, oikomenes. And so has the entire world heard the gospel in Paul's day? He didn't even know the Americas existed. So it's, and even in his mind, he was still trying to get to Spain and go spread the gospel other places. He knew that the whole world was kind of figurative for it's spreading around the Roman Empire, right?
That's a great point, yeah, because in that same letter to Rome, he's talking about let's go to Spain, implying that the gospel hasn't made it there yet. And here he's saying, and of course maybe he's suggesting that he's going to be part of that idea of taking it all to the world, right? That could be, like it's predicting his own apostolic mission or whatever. A good example too is when Caesar gives the census, right? Where he says, he wants to do a census on the whole world, right? Well, that's he doesn't mean like North America. It's not literally the whole world. He's talking about his world, his populated realm, if you will.
Right. Yeah. For him, the extent of the Roman Empire, which for them they thought about sometimes as like the whole world. Yeah.
True.
And so and just in some biblical terminology, when a new empire comes in, they'll look at that as like, okay, there's a kingdom over the entire world, and from our standpoint, that's not true. From them, it was an approximation that communicated a point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So let's talk a little bit about, I think, what is probably the most forceful passage. There's a handful that we could touch on, and there's a lot in the book that you go through that are just very important for this discussion. But one of the most important is 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 17, where we get what seems to be potentially a very detailed description of what the rapture is going to be like. So I can read through that passage and then maybe give us just some comments about, is this the rapture?
Yeah, sounds great.
But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. But since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will be raised first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Okay. So it seems like we're being caught up to the clouds. After this, do we go to heaven for 7 years, or what are we doing?
Yeah, this is the go-to verse. So whenever I was writing the book, I wanted the prophecy teachers to dictate the sort of passages that I looked at. I wanted to know, what did they think were the most important passages that founded their view of the rapture. And they named 3, essentially. Well, Tim LaHaye did. He had, I think, 3 most important ones. It was 1 Thessalonians 4, the passage you read, then John 14, 1, and then 1 Corinthians 15. And so I was like, okay, this is their text. Let's go to it and see what it actually says. And this is a text that so many people run to because it sure sounds like a rapture. You'll be caught up in the clouds, and at the coming of the Lord. When you look at this very closely, though, it doesn't say what it needs to say in order to have a rapture. Okay, there are lots of assumptions we bring to the text. So the assumption is Jesus comes back, and here the word "coming" is parousia, the parousia of the Lord, the presencing of Jesus when he shows up. You have this idea of harpazo, this being caught up. That's the rapture, snatched up. Whatever the word you want to use. And to meet him in the clouds, right? So the idea is that you are caught up, and then you're taken away for however long, and then that's what then you need other passages to come and fill in the other side of the story. Okay, what happens after you're taken away? And prophecy teachers will point to other passages. But one thing I want to say about this text is that it would be a question to prophecy teachers. I would just ask, where does it say that you will be caught up in the clouds and taken away to heaven?
As I read through this, through another lens, it doesn't say that we're going to go down, but it also doesn't say we're going to go up. There's no directionality after we get caught up.
100%. All it says is we'll be caught up to meet him in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. It makes no claim about where we'll be with the Lord. You have to bring that to the text. If you want to say you're going to heaven, you have to bring that to the text. If you want to say you're going to be with him on earth, you kind of have to bring that to the text too. So what my point is this: we need other data to help us make sense of this situation. We're going to have to bring assumptions to the text. The question is, what sort of assumptions best fit this text? And secondly, how do we find out those assumptions? Where do we find those assumptions? Okay, so this is a hermeneutical rule where if you want to know the content of a text, you have to know the context of the text. And context means not just paragraphs before and after, but also the world in which that text was birthed. Okay? This is a text to the church at Thessalonica, written in Greek, in a world that was very familiar with the terms that are used in this text. So there are 2 key terms in this text that are extremely important, that people in that day and time would have recognized. The first one, of course, is the one I said earlier, parousia, translated as coming. Parousia meant showing up, a presencing. It could be paired with the idea of a dignitary or a king who shows up and presents himself, right? In sort of royal regala kind of idea. Okay, so that's the first word. The second word that we need to be familiar with is in verse 17, where it says we will meet the Lord in the air. So meet, apantesis. And this is it's actually a technical term, and it's a term that had important political meaning, and in a kind of a citizenry context. So, for example, this word is used in Josephus in one of his books, and he talks of, well, it's not this exact word, but it's a form of this exact word, right? There's a slight spelling difference and stuff, but anyway, same word, root, and everything. And so this idea is that whenever a royal dignitary was coming into town, it was customary for the citizens of that town to stop what they were doing and to go out of the town and meet that dignitary, whether an emperor, a king, or whatever, ambassador, go out and meet them before they get into your town, before they enter the gates, to go out and meet them and then parade them back to the city. Okay, and we see this in Scripture, don't we? Can you think of a story where a king comes to a city and the people go out and parade him back in? What story?
Hosanna in the highest, laying down palm branches and coat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're parading Jesus. This is not unusual in this day and age. It's what you do. Now, it's hard kind of to imagine, I suppose, but not really. Like if you think of when dignitaries visit our city. So if the president wants to come to your city, typically what they do is they find a local Air Force base and they fly Air Force One into the city. Then they, bring him about wherever he's going to go. So there's not really like we have air travel now, right? And but back then you didn't. You just have chariots and things, and so you would, and those take time, and so you would know when they're coming. You would get advanced warning, and then you could go out and meet them. And Josephus uses this word to mean going out to meet them. But the idea, and this is very important, the idea is not that you go out to meet them and camp out with them, or they take you away somewhere else. The idea is that you parade them back into your city. Why? It's a political statement. It's to say, we honor you, we welcome you, this is your city, and we want to parade you into your city. We want to, and that's, so my point is this, it's just a question, which view in the ancient context makes better sense? We already don't see them being taken to heaven. That's just not in the text. You'll have to bring that assumption to the text. Now, to be fair, we also don't see them coming back, escorting that. We don't see that language. So we have to bring assumptions to the text. So what assumption has better data for it? How would the Thessalonians have understood this? What assumptions would they have had about these words and concepts? My argument is they would have the ancient idea of parading the leader back to the world. In fact, when you read other texts in the New Testament, it's not that you go to heaven. The idea is that heaven comes to you. That's
exactly what I was just about to ask. Is the assumption that we are going to be in heaven on the clouds playing harps for eternity, or does our hope reside in a earthly dwelling with King Jesus?
Yeah, it's heaven. It's heaven on earth. Right. It's heaven, New Jerusalem comes down to the earth, and the two become one. It's a marriage ceremony in Revelation.
Right.
That's how it's depicted.
We talked about this before on the podcast. Just that Second Peter idea of the that three-tiered cosmology. The what's above is burning up and going away, and then what's on the earth will be visible. The barrier between heaven and earth is dissolving, and then heaven is coming to earth, and God's throne being set up here with us. So that's, like you said, that's what we're doing here, is we're welcoming the King in. And I do have a follow-up question about this passage. This is somewhat unrelated from the rapture per se, but when we're caught up to the clouds, I think Jesus coming on the clouds, that takes us back to Daniel 7. Is there in any way, I know in Daniel 7, some will see that as the Son of Man is a collective term, and there are some ways in which Jesus is the singular, but we are, as the body, kind of the collective. So is there any kind of ruling with him connotations going on there, or is that purely just Jesus and we're just welcoming him back? What do you see going on there with the Daniel 7 allusion?
No, I think that's a very insightful point for you to make. I would 100% agree that there's Daniel 7 overtones here. That, riding the clouds in the Old Testament was something a deity did. It's even found among writings about Baal, or Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites. He was the cloud rider, but in the Old Testament, it's Yahweh who rides the clouds. And this is just, ancient ways of talking about the divinity and the sovereignty and the power of God. And riding the clouds is what God does. And so you mentioned Daniel 7, Jesus is the cloud, or the Son of Man is the cloud rider. And you're correct that some exegetes will see the Son of Man of Daniel 7 as a collection, as sort of a figure who's denoting a collective group of people, Israel, okay, or God's people. And so Christians are sometimes push back against that and say, well, wait a second, no, that's talking about Jesus. It's an individual. And what I like to do is say, well, don't toss out Hebrew exegesis too quickly here, because you can have both. Son of Man language there is collective and it's singular, and it's a beautiful thing because when you get into the New Testament, you have one temple, and that's Jesus's body, but you have the body of Christ collectively as the holy temple of God too. So you do have both. In fact, Paul writes in one of his letters to Corinth, he takes 2 Samuel 7:14, which is the prophecy that David would always have a son. You'll have a son on the throne, and I will be his father, and he will be my son. And this is, applied to Jesus messianically, this idea of sonship, of course. But in one of Paul's letters, he says he applies that to the church. In fact, even when he quotes it, he adds daughters. He says we are sons and daughters. So this singular idea of a king, a messianic king, is actually, pardon the pun, fleshed out in the church's life, as a people. And so when you, all to say, coming, back to 1 Thessalonians 4, it's interesting. We are caught up with him in the what? Oh, in the cloud riding idea. And so we will rule and reign. And that just reinforces the idea of a final eschaton image here, is that this is the time where God's people, all of us, are finally vindicated, and we assume the role that God has been planning from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up what Paul says in the letter to the Corinth, because I think it's in the same letter he says that also Satan will be crushed under our feet. It's like, wait a minute, that's Jesus. He's the serpent crusher.
That's Romans 16. Yeah, you're right.
No, we're collectively the serpent crusher with Jesus. So yeah, there's just both and of we are, again, an extension of, we're Christ's body. So yeah.
That's so good. That's a very insightful point that you make there. You're right. It's the serpent crusher is again fleshed out into the serpent crushers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, one more we wanted to tackle. Nate, do you want to read John 14:2-3?
Yeah, I think this leads well into this passage and trying to discuss John 14. So, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And so this, again, very much sounds like we're being raptured up to be with him. And so how do we explain this one?
Yeah, I guess I would begin by saying that, it's understandable why this would be seen as a rapture text, because I will take you to myself. That seems to have this idea of being taken somewhere. But again, we have to be very careful. That's an assumption we bring to the text. I think what's being said here is that we'll be united with Jesus again. It makes no reference to place other than in verse 2 where it says, I'm preparing a place, a dwelling place for you. So you have a place there, but why do we think that place is somewhere other than earth, when in fact, Revelation, if indeed it was written by the same writer of the Gospel of John, he would know this, right? Later on, at least, he would know this. He has this idea of God's dwelling place being on earth with people, right? In fact, that's what you see in at the end of Revelation, is that God's dwelling place is with men and women here on the earth. And so there's no reason exegetically to suggest that this means going away from earth. It could be that this is a text that's talking about the dwelling place, heaven, coming to the earth, right? And if you look at the context of this, Jesus is trying to comfort these disciples. And he wants to remind them that he's going to be with them and that they're going to be with him again. So the emphasis here is not so much on a place that they're being taken to. It's rather just being with Jesus again. And the way he's going to be with them is he's going to come back to them. He's going to take them to himself.
Right. Well, and it just made me think, there was one more thing about 1 Thessalonians that ties into this. So in 1 Thessalonians you have the dead rising and then the believers all coming up to Christ together. But in Revelation you see the dead raising right before the white throne judgment. And so where's this second step? If I'm reading this correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like Revelation portrays this kind of all at once going on, not like you said, his first coming and then this kind of pseudo coming and then the third coming. This is all happening at once, and then the dead are raised, white throne judgment, the city of God, the New Jerusalem, is descending out of heaven. And so the timeline here, if you're trying to plot this out on the map, which is not usually a great idea, but if you're doing that, you don't really see much of a spot for the dead raising, going to the rapturous place, and then dwelling in this city before it comes down. Just I could see someone making the argument of like, well, you're already in the city when it comes down, so why is that not the case?
Yeah, and I think you hit on a point here that's worth thinking about. Is you need a few extra steps in order to make the rapture theology picture work. And oftentimes you don't see those extra steps in Scripture. They kind of need to be assumed. You kind of have to, as they say, make the text do some gymnastics in order to make it kind of work out. And maybe I'm just a simpleton. I just like to keep things as simple as possible. I guess I don't really think that it's necessary to make the text more complicated than what it is. Now, I do think that it is healthy to, build on other texts and help them speak to one another. For example, I commented on John 14 and I brought in Revelation, and that's warranted, I think, maybe because it was written by the same person, and I think that's helpful. But at the same time, I think when you bring those other texts into dialogue with one another, you actually let the text itself make the picture that you're trying. You don't have to do much more than just letting them come together and start talking. It's kind of like when you're at a dinner party and you've organized the dinner party. If you do it well, you'll bring different people together who can offer different perspectives on a given topic. And all you really have to do is kind of just sit back and let the conversation go. And that's how I see reading scriptures. Let John 14 talk to Revelation 21, 22, and 19, and just it's kind of set back and see what picture emerges. And I think what we'll see is a very simple picture. It's not that complicated.
Yeah, I think
we make it complicated.
I think you're right that these texts can speak to one another, but first we have to honor the author's original intent within its own literary structure and its cultural contextual structure. For instance, Nate and I we live 10 minutes apart, but if we each say, "I'm going to the store," just something as simple as that, we're probably not going to the same store. We mean something very different in our own sub cultural context and what we mean. So these texts are doing the same thing. Now, with the many rooms in the house, this made me think of what is God's house? It's the temple. And so are there some priestly connotations here? I'm going to bring you into my house. Well, that's the dwelling of, at least in the Second Temple period, these places around where the priests will stay. And so is there a promise of bringing you into this sort of priesthood within this passage? Is that going on in your opinion?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I've never really thought of, the idea of a dwelling place here. I mean, I obviously that would be temple language, but I've never thought about the invitation to be within this dwelling place in John 14 as an invitation to be priestly, to do the work of a priest and have the life of a priest. But I do think that's very insightful of what you're pointing out.
And maybe you're right that I think you're right that the thrust of the passage is the comfort of the disciples. So that may not be on the forefront, but maybe at the least, you're coming back into the garden, you're re-entering this Adamic state, and the thrust of that right now is be comforted because you'll be with me. But again, we're looking towards the end there. The garden has come back. We were with God in the garden once again. I just can't help but think that might be behind the passage.
Yeah, I would have no problems with that because, are they, it's a layer of meaning, right? It would have been immediately recognizable at this moment, probably not, but after further reflection, perhaps so. So yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with what you're saying. In fact, I would say that's real insightful.
Cool. All right. So there's one more particular, I would say passage, but triad of passages that are not necessarily looking at the author's intent, the cultural and literary context, but one other thing that I thought of when I heard rapture growing up, and maybe the same for you all, is 1 Corinthians 15:50 through 58, where we are, taking off the perishable and putting on the perishable, taking off the body, becoming spirit, this kind of idea. And then that gets kind of meshed with 1 John 3:2, where it says becoming or seeing him will become like him. And then we also have the ideas from 1 Thessalonians 4 being caught up into the air. So you get kind of this picture of at least what was painted to me in, Jesus comes back for the rapture. We're caught up into the air, and then we see him. We become like him. The perishable becomes imperishable. The body becomes spirit, and then we go up to heaven. There is a big mixture of ideas in there, not all of them necessarily honoring the context that they're coming out of. But that is the picture that I feel like was developed in my mind. Nate, do you feel like you had the same picture as you were taught about the rapture?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think these passages were very much probably taken out of context a lot of times, but used to try to explain what would happen at the rapture.
Right. And I mean, 1 John 3:2, whenever he's talking about us becoming like him, he's talking about becoming pure, becoming clean, becoming sinless, not becoming from body to spirit. But I wanted to ask about 1 Corinthians 15 there, where it says we take off the perishable and put on the imperishable. So this is about us becoming no longer embodied, but just, gaseous spirits kind of. Is that what's going on here? Because that's often the picture that I feel like is talked about in popular rapture theology.
Yeah. So no, to answer your question, no, it's not about becoming like ghostly apparitions. And I think that is sort of the idea is that, leave the body behind. The body is bad. And, the idea is to become a soul forever, or to your true soulish self, right? There are a number of problems with that. The first of which is that it seems to deny creational monotheism, the idea that the one God has created the real world, and the real world has rebelled against the one God, and so God just abandons the real world, right? The physical realm, and he'll save the souls within the bodies, but he won't save the body. And the story that paints is one of tragedy, in my opinion. It describes a God who is perhaps unwilling, maybe incapable of actually doing a good job of things, right? And in fact, in the story of Scripture, he doesn't abandon anything. What he ends up doing is redeeming, right? That his goal is redemption. And when you look at 1 Corinthians 15 verses 50 and following, you do have the language of, that seems to be, throw off the body and embrace the soulish. Let's put off the perishable body so that we can put on imperishability. Let's get rid of mortality so that we can have immortality, and immortality equals the soul. Which in fact, that's not a good way to put it. I think what he's saying is that simply the 1 John passage that you mentioned, that we're just going to become like Jesus. That's what he's saying. We're just going to become like Jesus. And what did Jesus do after his crucifixion? Well, he was resurrected. His dead body was revived, and he came out of the ground, or the tomb. And now, interesting thing about his resurrected body is it's the same body as before. So we're not talking about like his old body was done away with and he was given a new one. But we're also not talking about resuscitation. His old body wasn't just resuscitated, like given divine CPR. No. There was a resurrection, a glorified state of his new body. It was a body, for example, that could walk through walls. It was a body that could appear and disappear. It was a body that could be assumed into heaven. It was a body that could eat fish. So it was sort of this body that we're unfamiliar with. And the language is such that you get the sense that early Christians weren't sure how to describe it. I'm not sure how to describe it. But
well, I like the analogy you draw between, look at Jesus's own resurrection there first, because he is the archetype and the firstborn of the new creation that we're going to be taken into. Even I've I heard people talk about like, well, he walks through walls, so obviously he is some kind of ghost that they could see and he can make himself be touched. But I mean, you got to keep in mind too that even before he died and resurrected, he also had a body that could walk on water, that could heal people, and so it doesn't mean him doing something out of the ordinary that is not natural does not mean that he is a ghostly apparition or something that is gaseous or you can pass through and so on.
Right. Yeah, and I think, and if you look at the context of 1 Corinthians 15, it's this idea that Jesus is the first fruits of our own resurrection, right? And so I'm not making the connection of that passage we were referring to. Paul is making that connection to the resurrection of Jesus, right? The whole chapter is about resurrection. And if we want to interpret this as just our souls going to heaven when we die, then what are we saying about the resurrection of Jesus? That it was just a soulish spiritual resurrection? If we say that, that's actually heretical. That's actually not Orthodox Christianity. Orthodox Christianity is that Jesus rose physically from the dead, right? I mean, this is a very early creedal formulation from very early on, right? Yeah, so the idea of a physical resurrection is I mean, it's central. It's a non-negotiable of early Christianity and just of the Christian faith that's been once and for all delivered to the saints. And so, coming back to this passage, what Paul is saying is not a soulish sort of escape from earth. He's actually talking about, when he talks about putting off the perishable, he's not talking about putting away the body. He's talking about putting away a corrupt body so that you can embrace a non-corrupt body, a body that's imperishable, a body that's immortal. And in fact, he even says at the beginning of that passage in verse 50, he says, flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of God. Now, when Paul uses the word flesh, it's the Greek word here is sarx. It typically always has a negative connotation. It means it's a synonymous for sin, essentially, the sinful body. The sinful body, this flesh and blood, meaning the body that's tainted, it can't enter the kingdom, and so it has to be transformed. And so, and Paul envisions this idea of Romans 6: if we're crucified with him, we're united with him in his crucifixion, we'll be united with him in his resurrection. And the idea is that is what he's talking about here, that we're gonna have that same physical body. It'll be different than what we're used to, but it'll be physical no less.
Right, and that brings me back to the ideas in 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter's talking about Noah's flood, and he views the world after Noah's flood as a new creation, as a new world. And then he begins to talk about how our hope is in a new creation, a new world. And so the idea isn't necessarily that we're going to have every atom evaporated and then an entirely new material world comes into existence, but rather we might have the idea that the material is staying here, but it's being cleansed, wiped away, like in the flood with the waters. That which God has already created is being given a new function or a new purpose. So our hope isn't necessarily in a new form of existence, but it's still in this world, but it's Jesus in this world, having cleansed it, renewed it like in the flood, and us being with him embodied.
It's sort of a baptism idea, right? That salvation is a crossing through the waters of judgment, right? This is why baptism language is so linked to crucifixion language, is that the crucifixion is an act of judgment simultaneously with being an act of mercy. And so this idea of the earth going through its own baptism, if you will, is a salvation moment, as you say. And I love the way you cash that out, is to say that this is a renewal effort. It's not a destruction effort, right? And so yeah, that's the sort of thing I think Paul is discussing here.
Absolutely, it's not a destruction effort. It's a renewal or a new creation effort. Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on and just explaining the rapture a bit more to us, or explaining some of these texts that are often supposed to contain the rapture, and just not only that, but helping us to reorient our hope not on these certain events, but to reorient them on the person and the coming of Jesus. And I really appreciate the way that you've also helped us frame this conversation, not in a way that is trying to militantly put down these other ideas or theologies, or just make it a hostile environment, but trying to help foster constructive conversations so that we as Christians can work together and learn from one another and even disagree with each other, but also still work together for the name of Christ.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I was just going to say that, these are discussions that don't happen in the church, and I wish they would. But I understand why they don't, because they can become very heated, right? And I think the church should remember that this culture that we live in doesn't always give us a good context for how to have discussions. So, for example, in our culture, if the idea is that if I say I disagree with you, sometimes that's taken to mean I hate you, right? And that's a terrible world to live in, if I could be honest. But I actually think the church can offer a different paradigm for these sorts of discussions, a discussion in which we're not afraid to say, maybe I was wrong, or maybe you're wrong and I'm right, or maybe I'm wrong and you're right. Let's cash this out in terms of, what's right and what's wrong. And then afterward, we can go have dinner with one another. It's not like, if Matt Halsted is wrong, okay, I want the truth. I'm pursuing the truth here. That's what matters the most to me. If I'm right and others are wrong, it's okay. Like I guarantee you, Matt Halsted is wrong about something. The cool thing is that if we come together, we can move together into the direction of truth and what Scripture says, but we need each other, and you have to have dialogue for this. So all to say, if any listener is, maybe taken aback by Matt's denying the rapture, Matt's recasting the story that I've been told, I'll own that. Like I am trying to recast that story, but I'm only doing it with the knowledge that I'm finite. Like I don't have all this figured out. In fact, in my book, I say there's a lot we can't know about the end times. And so I invite others to, tell me your stories. Tell me what you think. Analyze my own exegesis. Don't be afraid to question what I'm saying. I have blind spots. And I need you to do that, because that's going to help me grow as a Christian. And that's the most important thing to me. And you need me to do that for you. If we could facilitate those sorts of discussions within the church that are, safe places and they're low cost discussions, I feel like that will do two things. One, we'll get closer to the truth. But secondly, and very importantly, we'll show the world how we can talk, how we can have dialogue. And if there's ever a time in our world where we need to have dialogue, I mean, my goodness, this is it. Can I share a very quick story? I allude to this in the book. There's a pastor that in one of his books talking about the rapture, and I was just baffled by this after I thought about it at times. He quotes a passage from either 1st or 2nd Peter. I don't remember which the text is, but it's a text that says in the last days there'll be scoffers. I think it's 2nd Peter. Scoffers in the last days. And he made the comment, he said, the fact that we today have people denying the rapture is proof we're living in the last days, because in the last days there will be scoffers. And I thought about that. I'm like, man, that's pretty bold, because if I'm a congregant in his church, I would, he shut down the conversation. He has shut down the possibility of asking questions, because I don't want to ask him any questions about the rapture. I don't want to push back, because now I'm a scoffer already. Like I'm on the bad team. And I think, and that's why I'm pushing that's why I wrote the book, is that I want to say, ask questions, just ask questions. And we don't need to create environments where the question cannot be asked. And so that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to offer people as an invitation to ask questions.
Yeah, I love the culture that you're describing is a culture where the church can grow exponentially. And that's the kind of culture that I think, like you said, if the world sees that, they're going to see something different. And we're supposed to be different. We're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world, like we talked about in John 17. And that's the kind of culture you're describing.
Yeah. That's the kind of culture I want to grow up in. That's the kind of culture I want my kids to be in.
Yep.
And it takes a lot of work to create that culture, but it can be done. If I could take a verse out of context here, in our Father's house there are many rooms, and every room is painted slightly different in the kingdom. We all have our respective views and so forth, but it's okay to hang out with each other.